Hi, I'm Doug Beaumont, the Director of Religious Education for St. Joseph's Catholic Church, and I wanted to talk to you today about this virus going around and whether or not it is a sign of the end of the world. As many of you know, I used to be an evangelical Christian, and one thing that evangelicals are famous for is getting the end of the world wrong. And it's not just evangelicals, but lots of Christian and Christian-ish groups will pick up the Bible and say, look, we've read the book of Daniel, we've read the book of Revelation, we've looked at Christ's words in the Olivet Discourse, and we have calculated the date that the world's going to end. And sometimes these happen during significant dates, like the renationalization of Israel, or the Six-Day War, or Y2K. A lot of other times it happens when new technology comes out. So Social Security cards come out, people say it's the mark of the beast. Computer chip comes out, mark of the beast. World Wide Web, mark of the beast. And one of the other major indicators that we're about to start hearing about the end of the world again is when there are natural disasters or disease. And all of a sudden people start to remember that there seem to be a number of verses about those things, and the end time speculation begins. So today I have what I think will be some good news, followed by some bad news, followed by some good news again. Now, I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, but before I do, if you want to go grab your Bibles, that would be a good idea. Turn to Matthew chapter 24. Now, although the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are kind of the most popular go-to resources for prophecy about the end of the world, one of the most detailed prophecies is actually in the Gospels, in the words of Christ during what is known as the Olivet Discourse. This is the longest response that Jesus ever gave to a question, and it is his second longest discourse. Now, in some of your Bibles, you might even see the end of the world predicted or something like that in big bold letters above this chapter. But what I want to do very quickly is just walk you through how this chapter panned out, show you how it connects to the books of Daniel and Revelation, and then show how all of that connects to today. And I will warn you, we're going to be going through this very quickly. I would normally spend 3 or 4 hours on this. So I will leave it to you to do further research, but just really quickly, if you are in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, you see it begins by saying that Jesus left the temple. And what happens is his disciples point out the temple to him, and Jesus says, the day is coming when not one stone here will stand upon another. And that prompts the disciples to ask 3 questions. Down in verse 3, we see, tell us, when will this be? When will what be? The destruction of the temple. What will be the sign of your coming? And of the close of the age. So we're looking for a when question. When will the temple be destroyed? And then 2 what questions. What will be the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of the end or the close of the age? So Jesus begins and he says, there will be people coming and saying that they are the Messiah. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes. Now notice that already you're probably hearing some of the things that people point to that indicate the end might be coming soon, but the end is not yet. Jesus says, all this is but the beginning. So far, Jesus has not answered their question. He then points out that there's going to be tribulation in verse 9, a falling away or an apostasy from the faith in verse 10. False prophets will arise. And then he says the gospel will be preached throughout the world, and then the end will come. Well, there's the answer to the question, what will be the sign of the end or the close of the age? The gospel being preached throughout the world. Now, some people might look at that and say, oh, well, that hasn't happened yet, so obviously Jesus can't come back. Well, actually, it has. If you look at Romans 10:17 through 18, or Colossians 1:5 through 6, you will see that in the biblical sense of the world kind of being the empire, the Roman Empire at the time, the gospel actually went to the ends of the earth. Now, obviously, it's speaking not literally about the actual planet. But the point is, in this kind of biblical language, the gospel had already gone out. So then, Jesus says, so when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, flee Judea. Now, there's a couple important things here. First of all, the desolating sacrilege of Daniel had already happened. Hundreds of years earlier, when Daniel wrote, he spoke about what this abomination of desolation or the desolating sacrilege was, And yet Jesus says, when you see it. Well, the Gospel of Luke gives us a little bit of help here. In Luke 21:20, Luke explains that what Jesus was referring to was Jerusalem, the city, being surrounded by armies. In other words, it's going to be besieged. Jerusalem's going to be besieged. And so if you see this starting to happen, you better get out of Judea because something bad's coming. Now notice, Jesus doesn't say, leave the planet Earth because it's about to end. No, this is something that's happening locally in Judea. It wouldn't really make sense to flee Jerusalem if it was going to be something that happened to the whole earth. Well, then he says, there will be great tribulation, false Christs, false prophets, signs and wonders, and immediately after those days, get this is verse 29. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, the heavens will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Well, there's our answer to what will be the sign of your coming. Namely, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven. Now, this sounds like a world-ending event, doesn't it? But guess what? It isn't. In the Bible, in numerous places, Isaiah 13:10, Ezekiel 32:7, Joel 2:10 through 11, Zephaniah 1:15. All over the Old Testament prophets, they use this kind of world-ending language to describe what's known as the day of the Lord, or the day of God's wrath. It's when God destroys a given people group or judges them for some evil that they have done. And in the cases that we read about this in the Old Testament prophets, it's usually by an army besieging a city or a nation and destroying them. Well, that's exactly what we've been talking about, haven't we? So in biblical language, this is not end of the world language, even though it sounds like it to us. Well, then Jesus says, when you see all these things, know that he is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till these things take place, but of that day and hour no one knows. Remember, they asked 2 what questions and 1 when question. What is the answer to the when will this take place? This generation will not pass away till all these things take place. So there's a couple things we got to understand here. Number one, when Jesus uses the words this generation, every time he says that in the Gospels, he's always referring to the people that he's talking to. He's not referring to some future generation, he's talking to the generation of people that he's talking to. If he's talking to adults and that generation won't pass away, it's going to have to be something that happens in the first century. Did it happen in the first century? Well, remember what the when question was about. When will this take place? What's this? The temple being destroyed. Jesus is saying the temple will be destroyed within this generation. Well, guess what? In AD 70, the Romans came, besieged Jerusalem, surrounded the city with armies, and then destroyed it and the temple. That all happened within 40 years of Jesus' words, 1 generation. So what we can see is that in this passage, the most famous of all end-of-the-world predictions, Jesus is actually talking about something that happened in AD 70. Now, I said there was a connection to the book of Revelation, so let's turn there, specifically Revelation chapter 6. In Revelation chapter 6, St. John sees this amazing scroll in heaven. It's got 7 seals on it, right? So you've got to break all of these seals before you can unroll the scroll and see what it says. Now, these are considered the first plagues or the first judgments of the book of Revelation. And listen to what they are. The first seal is a conqueror with a crown. In other words, some king who's coming to conquer. Then the second seal is the seal of war, peace being taken from the earth. The third seal is famine, where you have to spend a whole denarius just for wheat. The fourth seal is death. It's death from famine. It's death from pestilence or disease, and death from wild beasts. The fifth seal are martyrs under the throne praying to God. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to earth. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's day of the Lord language. We have war, rumors of war, that should sound familiar. Famine, that should sound familiar. Death from pestilence and wild beasts. Martyrdom, tribulation for the saints, and then a day of the Lord judgment. It's pretty much the same thing. It's very close to a parallel with what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. Now we know Matthew 24 is referring to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because that temple is the one that fell. Even if they rebuild the temple, it'll never be that temple again. Now, none of this means that God couldn't do a double fulfillment, right? At the very end of the world, he might take all of this prophecy of Christ's first coming and apply it to his second coming. But I think that the important thing to note here is this. He says, when you see all these things, know that he is near. In other words, it's not just earthquakes. It's not just famine. It's not just disease. It's when all of these things take place together. And again, even if this is a prophecy just concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, if it happens again, it's going to have to be something like that. And what that means is that just one sign doesn't cut it. In fact, even when there's a bunch of signs, false Christs, wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, even when all those things are taking place, Jesus says, hey, this isn't the end. The end has not yet come. Right now, we have a disease that is messing with our lives. As Americans, we have gotten very used to things being pretty easy. If I want water, all I got to do is turn a handle. If I want food, all I got to do is walk across the street and buy some. We're used to extremely good medical care, extremely good government programs, extremely good church charities. We're just not used to having our lives disrupted by the kinds of things that have been disrupting people's lives for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, look at the Black Plague. Look at the Holocaust. There are life-ending, massive things that have happened to people, and none of them have signaled the end of the world. I mean, can you imagine being in Germany during World War II? Adolf Hitler taking over the world, the destruction of the Jews. I mean, if Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, he's going to be a pretty tough one to top. Communist leaders have killed far more people than Adolf Hitler did during the Holocaust, and yet none of this, as it turns out, has signaled the end of the world. So I would say this, the good news is there is no biblical reason to think that anything is really happening right now. And please understand that I am not trying to just ignore the deaths that have occurred. Any death is a tragedy, but when we look at the numbers, the coronavirus has not been anywhere near as bad as things that we take for granted and do every day, knowing full well that doing those things is going to kill a large number of people every year. People have been predicting the end of the world for so long that this book catalogs hundreds of movements throughout time where people have thought that the end was near and were wrong. Entire cults like Mormonism and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists have grown up around alleged prophets who thought they figured out when the end of the world was. And what they all have in common is that they're all wrong. Now that's the good news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is bad things are going to continue to happen. I don't think there's a writer in the New Testament that doesn't promise suffering for God's people. We should not be surprised by tribulation. We should not be surprised by apostasy, by famine, or disease, or earthquakes, or martyrdom. It happens all the time. The fact of the matter is the end of the world is coming within one generation for everybody currently alive on this planet. Why? Because we're all going to die. Everybody on this planet is probably going to die, unless Jesus comes back and the resurrection takes place while some of us are living. The end has come. Judgment has come for every single human being that has been born in the last 2,000 years. So that's the bad news. You're going to die of something. You're going to suffer from something. It doesn't have to be the end of the world in order for you to suffer and die. Now, I said I had some good news, some bad news, and some good news. So here's the good news. The good news is, if we are faithful, if we endure to the end, as Jesus says in Matthew 24, we will be saved. This life is a preparation for heaven. The suffering that we go through purifies us. It helps purify others. It helps get us ready for seeing God, something that would kill us right now. We are so imperfect that looking upon infinite perfection, infinite goodness, infinite love would literally kill us. God gives us this time on earth to purify us through suffering, to remind us that we are mortal. Memento mori. Remember your death. Death is coming for you. May not be the rider of the pale horse, and the end of the world, but death is coming for all of us. And if we use this time to prepare for that death, we don't have to fear it. Once again, I'm Doug Beaumont. I'm the Director of Education here at St. Joseph's Catholic Church. I would highly recommend you look around our YouTube channel for additional teachings. We're pumping a bunch of content into the channel now that we're all having to work from home. Watch Mass on our live feed on Facebook. Go to our website and look at the resources that we have for you. This is not a time to slack off. This is a time to wake up and prepare ourselves for the vision of God.